can hear me, just what's up, Andrea? But this topic was begun last year at the diversity panel, which sort of focused not really on LGBTQ plus issues. And so Andrea and I have had several Facebook message discussions over the last year about this topic. My paper this year, which will come via satellite from St. Pete, Florida, is on heteronormativity and infinite jest. One of the questions that I would like to pose, I have a few questions, but maybe we can get some sort of consensus, is, does anyone agree that there's somewhat of a gap when it comes to this topic in Wallace Studies, the LGBTQ plus topic? Do people agree that this is something that needs to be looked at more in Wallace Studies, the LGBTQ plus topic?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely say the lack of LGBTQ characters means that there's an absence that we need to think about, we need to talk about.
Who is, oh yeah, okay. Can I see, who's talking just then?
It's me, it's Ryan.
What up, Ryan?
Not much, how you doing?
You know, one of the things in my paper is that I focus on infinite jest. There are, let's say, gay characters in infinite jest, but they're all sort of pushed to the margins, and they're all sort of good for nothings. That's kind of what my paper is about. But
and they're pitiful. They're pitiable and pitiful.
Yeah, they're just kind of shit on the whole time, and also treated as different. Can anybody think of anything else in Wallace other than infinite jest where this is the case? Was one of my questions.
Lyndon from Girl with Curious Hair. David Boyd has I don't remember if they're married or not, but a serious boyfriend.
So little expression sadness. Yeah.
So you're saying in Girl with Curious Hair, Lyndon?
Yeah, the story Lyndon.
But even in that, it's like a sort of looking like a scandal, sort of, and it's hidden.
Yeah, and the character dies anachronistically.
Yeah. Who's talking, by the way?
Yeah.
Over here in the corner.
Oh, hi, corner person.
What? Throw it into the back. So yeah, so you found, and that's early Wallace too. I mean, Girl with Curious Hair is really. So what? Can anybody think of anything else? I mean, so I guess then the next question would be sort of already answered is, like, there's probably not any, what do I have here? Any positive representations or any good representations in Wallace of LGBTQ plus characters either. I mean, if there's really no characters at all, then there's probably not any positive representations, right?
I think even more than that, there's no realistic representations.
Realistic representations.
I imagine a part of the problem would be that during the time when Wallace was writing, I mean, you had Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you had a lot of culturally very explicit means of forcing LGBTQ individuals to basically hide their identities. Like I had one of my roommates in the Army, for example, he was gay, and I didn't know. We were roommates for a year, and I just never noticed it because he was so good at hiding it. So I wonder if Wallace may not have written that many characters because he didn't realize how many LGBTQ individuals he may have known in life.
I think this kind of goes back to what we were, sorry, Tom, I might have interrupted you, but this kind of goes back to what we were talking about last year when we were talking about race, is that it just might be a group of people he either didn't know or didn't know he knew. So, like, we talked last year about how he did not write different races well when he did try to represent other races. So it's just, he's a white dude from the middle of America. It's not exactly like, no offense to the folks who love normal Burn, but it's not like normal Illinois is teeming with an LGBT scene that he could like familiarize himself with and be part of or just witness, especially in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, that was actually one of my questions that I kind of wanted to throw up to the audience and see what you all think. Do you think that his own sexuality and his own, let's say, biography and all of that, how much do you think that really affects what he writes about?
Well, I think in the story Little Expressionless Animals, it is perhaps the closest he gets to doing an okay job of writing gay characters. But of course, the way he writes them is, I could see why he felt more comfortable doing it because it's a lesbian relationship. So he's writing about why a woman is attractive. So the only switch he's really doing is just making another woman say that. So I could see why maybe that felt maybe easy or comfortable for him to do.
And remind me the name of the I don't remember if she was a first person protagonist, but the main character in that story.
I think it's Faye and Julie, or Faye and Reagan.
Yeah,
Julie.
The main character in that story did not have much of a personality. So that's where I know when 2 years ago, I don't know if Tom went into this when I couldn't hear him, but part of the reason that we sort of themed this year's diversity panel around LGBTQ representation is because 2 years ago we talked a lot about gender. Last year we ended up talking a lot about race. It wasn't really planned, it just happened. So we just decided this year, let's throw out a new topic. But 2 years ago when we were talking about women, and then when Diego Baez, who's the one of the coordinators of the diversity committee who couldn't be here because his wife just had a baby not too long ago. So yay, Diego.
Congrats, Diego.
I don't know if he's watching, so yay. Anyway, Diego and I were both on the podcast talking about gender, and I sort of have am of the opinion that there's no Wallace character or protagonist that he writes that's a woman that I'm like, oh yeah, I definitely identified with this character being a woman. But on the plus side, he doesn't like. There was something on the internet of people writing very bad women, like who are always very aware of their parts. And they're always heaving, and like they're always grabbing something, or they're always thinking about them. So at least he didn't do that. But in the beginning, especially with Lenore in Room of the System and those two characters in Little Expressionless Animals, to me seem kind of blank. They don't. Their personalities don't really resonate with me. I don't remember them very well. Even though Hal, when he's not speaking, he doesn't speak for the majority of the book. I still remember Hal, I remember who he is, I remember something about his personality. I know this is sort of diverging from where we are, but I don't know if that has to do with her being a woman or her being a lesbian woman, but I think it could be more than, both and kind of thing.
Yeah, how much, in the research for my paper, because my background isn't in queer studies or gender studies, but there seems to be, queer studies was essentially founded on like feminist theory. And so is there anybody in the crowd that has gender studies or queer studies in their background? Raise your hand, nobody? Anybody? All right. Ooh. So I have a question for y'all. One of the things that in my research for my paper is Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet. And one of her goals was to sort of retroactively apply these kinds of theories to like past literature. And I'm just, so I guess if the question, the hypothetical, or the question were posed, is this even fair to consider this on Wallace? And her question is like obviously, or her answer is obviously yes. But how would you, y'all with the background, how would you approach Wallace in queer studies specifically?
I think in relation to, the one figure I'm particularly interested in is the figure of Hugh Helen Steepley. And
yeah.
Kind of coming at that from a viewpoint that, realising that is so problematic, and the conversations I have with people about the reasons why that is problematic, but the fact that was even attempted, the fact that it starts kind of horrendously badly on the mountainside with the this attempt of it's even described as a kind of a grotesque attempt at presenting in a womanly way, the cocked hand to try and affect a kind of feminine way of smoking, but then the ridicule aspect of it. And the thing that interests me in that is then the moment in the text where there seems to be a switch when we're off the mountainside, and with the exception of only one example, and this is where Hugh Helen reflects on the failed marriage that's gone before. The switching pronoun, I find, is kind of consistent from that point. The fact that Helen is viewed as Helen, not as Marat seems to kind of view her as this kind of grotesque figure with the breast pointing in the wrong direction and the ladders in the tights.
That's really interesting, and I'm going to just turn this down just because I turned that up, but and I don't know if you can see me because it might be a slow connection, y'all cut out, but that's really interesting because, like, for example, we can talk about sexuality, but it's almost like the Helen Hugh Steepley is almost gender. It's almost like the trans community, and I guess, yeah, so LGBTQ plus community, Helen Hugh Steepley. That wasn't, I think that's really interesting that you bring that up, because that was actually, for that reason, because my paper is not on gender, it's on sexuality and heteronormativity. But would you say that Helen Hugh Steepley is probably the most prevalent LGBTQ plus character in Infinite Jest, possibly Wallace?
Yeah, I would say so. I think for the amount of, I think that the fact that, with the three main kind of settings of the novel, or the three kind of distinct aspects of the novel, the ETA, I'm going blank now, but yes, any house, yeah, there are only kind of few characters that seem to kind of cross those boundaries, and Joelle appears to be one, Hugh Helen appears to be one, it escapes me.
I read about Port Tony.
Yes, yeah. But again, it's there's that kind of understanding that, and from the conversations I've had with students is that there is the opinion that Hugh Helen is as the butt of a joke. That it's a kind of a figure, a figure of fun to poke at. However, that for me would be, if that were to be the case, why the attention to detail on the pronoun change for once we're off the mountainside? Whereas I said, it's only when Hugh Helen reflects on this kind of failed marriage. It's something to do with wearing a jumper that where she felt ungainly and simian, It's consistent, and I think again with the Paul Tony section and the kind of the problematic nature. I mean, going back to the archive and his naming of Paul Tony as Queer Tony, and then obviously there's some editorial decision made there. Well, but why choose Paul as the as the you're going to take queer out, why put that word in particular in? So again, there are aspects with Paul Tony's experience and the experience of the red leather fags that are that are kind of running around town. But for me, the change of language around those sections is that you cannot read Paul Tony's you cannot read those sections quickly. You have to, you have to pause, you have to stop, and that for me I find is kind of significant. As I said, I understand it's kind of it is problematic, and there will be I've had people that just dismiss this offhand that no, he's wrong, this is disgraceful, this is disgusting, but it's those kind of aspects that I see as why slow the language down that way? Why write in this specific dialect where you have to pick through what does eliminate someone's map for keeps? What does that mean? You have to go back.
I think that's really interesting too. And on the sort of topic of pronouns, poor Tony at one point and it's in my paper, is referred to as his, her, its, and so I think especially the trans community is and just like you say is really not true. And another thing that I write is Oren, being a football player and being very into Helen Hughes deeply. And then there's a part where they're talking, or Hal's recalling some anecdote or recollection on Oren seeing the green door and having a conversation with himself that I read as basically himself suspecting Oren of being gay. I think that there's just a lot of unspoken discrimination. It's a little bit implicit. I mean, nowhere outright. I guess Helen Hughes deeply is kind of made fun of in like his, her appearance. But I think we're developing a theme here. That's for sure.
We just got a comment on the Facebook feed.
What's up?
He says the character Helen Hughes deeply is more about Oren's relationship to women than anything LGBTQ, which was what I was about to say, and then you mentioned it too. That Hugh dresses up as Helen in order to get closer to Oren, but it's definitely like the trans nature of Helen Hugh becomes the butt of a joke, and and trans people for so long have been the butt of a joke. Like, I don't want to reveal too much about my exciting life, but I've been rewatching old episodes of Law & Order SVU because that's what one does when one doesn't want to write one's work. And like the old first couple seasons, Olivia Benson using the word tranny. I'm just like shocked. Like, no, Olivia Benson, you're too woke for this. But they're using the word tranny, but that's the same time period because that show is what, 20-something years old, and it's around the same time period. But Captain Cragen using the phrase the he/she's and the I'm just watching it this was the culture that this book was created in, during, around. I'm not excusing it at all. I'm just it's a way to try to understand why there's all this like Tom was saying, the implicit bias associated with some of these characters. And it's the person commenting on the Facebook's name is Tim. I don't know how lagged we are or anything. And if Tim wants to, I've got weird setup on my computer, so I can't see some of the people in the room. But if Tim wants to have some sort of rebuttal at all, feel free, because I've got the comments open. But I think that to say it's not LGBT related isn't necessarily true. It may not be intentionally trans related, but there's definitely that implicit, it's okay to laugh at the trans community because dressing up like the other gender is funny.
Right. Or weird or different or not normal or not the usual. And here's the other thing too. I mean, I actually appreciate that comment, but I have to say that it takes a little bit of, what do they call it? You know, suspension of disbelief to sort of take a lot of this stuff kind of just aesthetically. Yeah. So, I mean, it's
but we're also talking about a book with terrorists in wheelchairs and giant babies roaming through a dystopian garbage forest. So I think there are some things that we have to suspend our disbelief for.
I do. I want to have a hardcore band named Garbage Forest, by the way.
I think you have to call it Diaper Baby Garbage Forest.
Oh, got it. What about you, Grace? What are you thinking?
I have no thoughts right now, to be honest. I feel not super equipped to talk about like this topic in particular. That's not been my area of study, but I am enjoying the conversation so far, and yeah, I think it's worth looking at. I mean, I feel like the conversations around gender and race in his work has been really productive, so yeah, particularly.
I mean, just to further the point, I mean, this is on the back of Allard's discussion before, and this kind of, this kind of setting up of the perhaps isn't just one particular way of viewing this. So I could see that, Hugh Helen can be this figure of fun to poke fun at, and that's why she is in there. I think you can then make the case that because of the gender pronoun shift, that there is an actual shift, and a questioning then, well, what does it mean to be a woman and to be seen as a woman? Hugh Helen is, through the eyes of the pro-rector at PTA, a woman. Through the eyes of Orin, is a woman.
Right.
We have that, and then in terms of the figure of fun, surely almost everyone certainly in Infinite Jest is a figure of fun in some way. Don is huge, oddly kind of huge. The tennis players have the the sort of the one big arm through the pumping of the tennis ball to strengthen it. Joelle, I suppose a perfect kind of cisgender character as ever could be. So beautiful that you will lose your mind over her. Is walking around in a veil. It's like it seems everyone is a potential target to be poked fun at, which then again you start to think, well, is there something to say about that? And do we shut do we lock the conversation down? And Orin in himself with his unsuccessful, these kind of unsuccessful sexual couplings that he goes after that never bring this satisfaction. So much so that he wakes up in his cold sweat constantly every, this kind of Sisyphus moment he goes to sleep and he's in the terror. Is, as you say, I mean, this kind of maybe kind of implicit or sort of
yeah, well, it's a that even Helen Hughes Deeply being seen as either or both, male or female, it's still is representative of, let's say, like a binary, and it's kind of interesting. The fact that Wallace has such an emphasis, he doesn't seem to apply. Although there is one phrase in Infinite Jest, it does essentially name that sort of hazy sexuality of adolescence or something. But I don't know. I think so. We have Helen Hugh, we have poor Tony. We have a character out of Little Expressionless Animals.
We have a hand up too. I don't know your name at all.
Oh, okay, what's up?
Sorry.
just wanted to add two things. One, the character in Little Expressionless Animals, I think it's Julie, who's in the lesbian relationship, also wears a mustache in men's clothing so she doesn't get recognized in public. And that's supposed to be like a comic image of her sweating and the mustache falling off. And then also, I think, if I remember correctly, Maddie Pemulus, in one of the Infinite Jest footnotes, is like raped by his father, and there's this continual use of the phrase like Fukin Jaboom with this Irish.
Oh, yes!
And then in the
the worst!
Yeah,
the worst.
uses,
it's all over my paper, bro. You gotta hang out. You gotta
and then the last one is he uses the phrase both in although of course you end up becoming yourself, and I think like once or twice in an Infinite Jest footnote of being like raped by psychic Bedouins. He talks about a few times.
Yeah. Raped by psychic. Jesus Christ, fucking Wallace.
I just got, I asked, because the person on Facebook, his name is Tim, he said, I asked him for clarity on who he means by him, but I haven't gotten that yet. Sorry, Tim. He says, Murat makes fun of his inadequate performance, however, which I think would be legitimately more offensive to the LGBTQ community. By him, I'm assuming he means Oren, but
I think. Go ahead. I think this Tim means him as in Hugh Steeply.
Oh yeah.
As a unconvincing performance as a woman, possibly, is what I'm reading.
Oh yeah. I just confused Murat and Steeply. I'm sorry, in my head. I'm the worst. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is probably the most obvious question. I mean, we kind of all agree that this is kind of latent in Wallace, right? This, let's say, bias, like it's my paper, but heteronormative bias. Mine's only about Infinite Jest, but like, would we think that maybe not, or let's say an anti-LGBTQ plus bias in Wallace? Agreed? Does everybody agree?
I would just throw in maybe the qualification that I think Wallace has a real problem with sexuality in general. Like there aren't a lot of like great, healthy, straight sexual relationships. I mean, Brief Interviews is all about sort of how disordered male straight sexuality is and how it screws people up. So I think it's definitely fair, and whether it's a product of its time or something else, I think Wallace's treatment of LGBTQ characters is problematic. But I think sort of sexuality in general, it's not like he's holding up heteronormativity as a ideal to strive after. It's sort of, in and of itself, seems to be problematic in this fiction. One other character I wanted to throw out is Drinian in The Pale King, who doesn't really fit. I mean, he might be asexual, right? I mean, it's been a while since I read it, so I might be somewhat misremembering it. But like, it feels like the reason.
How do you spell Drinian? You said
Drinian, D-R-I-N-I-O-N. He's the one who levitates off in his chair. And he's able to pay attention to and engage with Meredith Rand and hear her story, and not just want to get with her like everybody else in the character. He actually like listens to her, in part, if I remember it correctly, because he's not attracted to her where everybody else is. So that might.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because Hal in Infinite Jest is there's a line that says he's essentially asexual. That there's something that he doesn't, not asexual, but he doesn't have any sort of sexual preference. So that's really interesting. Like there's something like if there's one person who can live his whole life without ever having sex or something, it's like that. But that's really interesting.
I think more than almost anything else, I think that Wallace just has a really, like the writer Wallace, I'm not talking about the person Wallace, I didn't know him personally, I'm not going to try to speak to that, but Wallace as a writer seems to have just a very difficult relationship with sex in his writing. He writes around sex a lot, but doesn't seem to want to write, like I think the closest thing we come to a sex scene that I can remember is in the cheerleader dress, the outfit.
Avril.
Yeah, thank you. Avril and John, no relation. That's like, but you still don't even really see a sex act. It's just like this creepy performance, and it's been happening. And you have Molly Nopkin talking about all these people having sex, but you never actually, even in brief interviews with hideous men, which when I teach that, my students, oh, it's so gross, he talks about sex all the time. Like, but he talks around it instead of about it. And you can even see, does anybody know the show New Girl? Someone knows. Does anybody remember that episode where they're all talking about their first time and Jess is taking too long because that's Jess's way, and Schmidt, who I assume is named after the Wallace character Schmidt, just yells at her and he says, David Foster Wallace, where is the sex? So it's even like in pop culture, there's this like known thing that he just never gets to it. He talks around it, he talks about it, he talks leading up to it, but he never actually gets to it. So as a writer, he doesn't seem to actually want to go into that stuff. I mean, I don't blame him, but I'm not a writer, so I wouldn't want to write like a sex scene. Like, how do you even do that? You'd be revealing a whole lot about yourself and your own proclivities if you did that. But yeah, sorry, hand person.
Sorry, I was just going to say that I think in Linden there's a description of David Boyd and his boyfriend, and David Boyd talks about like how his boyfriend opens him up and goes inside of him and then like yells things about like you are missing from. Does anyone remember what I'm talking about? There's like one depiction of an anal sex scene in Linden that's like pretty explicit about like one person being opened up and another person being inserted. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
I got like most of that. Is it a hetero sex scene or is it a non-hetero sex scene?
No, it's two men.
Yeah.
I don't remember that at all.
And what story was this in?
It's in
Linden.
Linden. From Girl with Curious Hair. It's like 60, 70 pages into the book or so.
Interesting.
And the other aspects about Linden, it's been a little bit since I've read it, but is all the relation to having power and being in proximity to power as well. I don't know. One of my, a larger question I would have is, what do we think about like whether or not Wallace was actually trying to, in his own limited way, explore aspects that you would normally explore in queer theory? I guess like one of my points is in the conversations between Steepley and Marat, Steepley is standing in for America. So if we keep that going and then we start talking about Hugh Helen and all of that, is Wallace trying to say something there about America? And then in relation to that, I wonder if it's like the whole idea of when people, which thankfully it's a little bit less now, but it used to be really bad of seeing a homophobe and claiming that they're closeted. And that is sort of just a really easy way to think you're being a good woke person, but still assigning all of the trouble to gay people in some respect. I mean, I do know of instances where that has been true in like literal people I know, but as far as just when it's claimed each time.
As a trope, I guess.
As a trope, yeah. And so I wonder if Wallace is kind of getting into that territory of he's attempting to do good things, or I wonder if he's mostly just trying to use the like concepts, you know, self and other and Lacan, you know, if he's trying to build off that sort of thing to just explore or not, I don't know.
Well, I definitely think that, like I kind of say this, like in the film Accomplice, there are sort of aesthetic stand-ins, like there are aesthetic elements that,
Not anymore, though. I'm just
It's the goats in the system.
Did you all lose Tom? Because I lost Tom.
Yeah, we lost Tom.
Oh, Tom, if you can hear us, we lost you.
Yeah, Tom?
He's totally frozen on my screen. Oh no! I don't know where he was going with that. So I can't even like try to finish up his sentence.
Tom, are you there?
Oh, let me message him real quick. I will try to talk and entertain you while I'm doing that.
Well, we could, or maybe we could get a few conversations going on this end as well. So, one question I do have is, seeing kind of the complexity in terms of how we can view Wallace's portrayal of LGBTQ characters. How, well, especially like Michael, the point you brought up. All of his characters, regardless of orientation, are kind of objects of humor to a degree. And one of the things that I have heard brought up is the fact that if you have a marginalized group and you're writing about that group and you specifically make it so none of them have any personal character flaws, that itself becomes a form of discrimination as well. And so a question I would have is, how do we, I want to say, where do we go from here? But in the sense of, how can we address Wallace, address his work, recognizing that there are these shortcomings because there was a lack of awareness, not just on Wallace's part, but as a culture, And so in what ways could we maybe use his writing to better understand what writing of that era was like?
I don't know. One of the things I was thinking, like a connection that popped out to me when the specter of Law and Order SVU was brought up earlier, I think one of the best ways to me to describe what I see, and especially poor Tony, I think, but also even in like Helen Hugh, is these characters come off as very melodrama characters in a certain way. Like especially considering all the writing that Wallace has done about television, like those particular characters strike me as some of the more like kind of cut from TV drama type characters in Infinite Jest at least. And I think parallel to that, in talking about the point was floated earlier that kind of all of the characters in Infinite Jest are ridiculous in some way, or are exaggerated, or strange, or figures of mockery in some way. But I think one of the things that raises in discussing the text and discussing the way those characters are written is what it means when you have that sort of pseudo level playing field of playful mockery and making characters bizarre, but when some of those characters represent groups that are derided in reality, and like what the responsibility of that, like the sort of raising the specter of something I see a lot in online discourse of being an equal opportunity offender, which I don't think Wallace is doing in Infinite Jest, but I think that if you look at, I think that shows the sort of hollowness, if not risk, in not paying attention to what happens when you are making a certain kind of melodramatic mockery of both the marginalized and the not marginalized in equal measure, I suppose. And then I'd stop talking.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good point. It's like you can't be equal opportunity if one group will have that stuff just bounce right off, and the other group, it's like, no, this is how they're actually treated in real life.
Yeah, you can't. If you're part of the group, then you can mock the group. If you're not part of the group, you can't. You can't do that. We can call ourselves Wallace LitBros, but if people from the outside start doing that, no, you can't. You can't call us the LitBros, because we don't want to be associated with the people who are actually LitBros, but we can joke around about it. But I think that's a good point. And then something I was just thinking is that there's a lot of characters who don't have necessarily any sort of sexuality associated with them, and like maybe they could totally be gay characters and we don't know about it, but we just assume that they're not because it's not mentioned. And I think that's part of that heteronormativity that Tom was talking about. And I think he'd be proud of me because I just mentioned heteronormativity when he's not here. I did invite him back, by the way. Apparently not. He said it didn't send. But that's what that is. It's we assume the white male cisgender heterosexual when it's not otherwise mentioned.
I think in some ways we're only just starting getting into the kind of levels of complexity. I mean, from what was just stated over there about, you know, if you're...
Got me back. How's it going, everybody?
Good, but now I need to leave and come right back because I can't hear Tom again.
Well, I appreciate it. My phone did that thing where it like turned off because it got too hot. So I really appreciate everybody coming to the panel. We can probably wrap up real soon.
Tom, I had a question kind of for you, given that your paper is on heteronormativity, and that you're taking this approach and that you're looking at Wallace through this lens of like LGBTQ representation. Like, how has it changed your approach to his, how has it changed your approach to like his work? And like, I guess a general question for people is like, is there, how would it change our approach to reading Wallace based on like what we've been talking about today? Does it like change how you orient yourself with his writing, or is it just another consideration?
Yeah, I think it does. You know, I've been writing about this topic in other, like specifically in photography and in visual art, and yeah, it's once it's noticed, it's difficult to not notice. You know, like in my paper, some of the slurs that are used, they're just kind of flat out unacceptable. Like, did anybody feel uncomfortable reading like, you know, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer? And I'm from the South, but you know, we were forced to read that racist shit. But like, you know, it's like some of that stuff just doesn't really fly anymore. And I think, you know, if the point is to say this is wrong, this is bad, nobody should read Wallace because of it, you know, that's one thing. But, you know, or at least my paper is basically saying that it's kind of actually representative of the time. If realism is the key and mimesis is the goal, then it worked. So I mean, it's kind of blatant. It's a little bit in your face, and also too, there's my overall, I think, and I'll speak for Andrea as well, goal to sort of contribute some of the holes in Wallace Studies as well. This seems to be like something that needs to be talked about a little bit more.
I'm gonna go out and ahead and say that you intended the pun with filling holes. Just throwing that out there.
Touche. Don't let them hear how we speak to each other, Andrea.
I'm a disgusting person.
Jeez. Come on. I'm drinking kombucha right now.
I belong in the gutter. Yeah, I think that, I'm just going to kind of piggyback off of Grace's question. I think that there are so many different lenses through which to read almost any author, but especially Wallace. Like, you can read him, because I'm sort of interested in that, like, I'm boring. I like the post-structural and deconstruction type stuff. I'm really interested in language and how sentence structure can inform something about a character, because I'm a weirdo and I like that kind of thing. So that's how I read Wallace the first time I went through and had to read everything all in one semester because Mary Holland told me to. And but then you can go back and read everything through a feminist lens, and then you can read it through even further, like this gender queer studies lens, and then you can read it through a cultural historical lens. And I think that reading Wallace through all those different lenses is especially valuable because it's so complex and there's so much to offer.
I agree. And I think we have a consensus from the audience as well. Y'all agree?
Yeah.
Awesome.
The timing on the consensus is perfect. It's currently 1:52, and so I do want to wrap up fairly quickly.
Can I add one thing?
Oh yeah, go ahead. That's fine. Yeah.
Just because I had Matt look this up, just to comment on our awesome diversity-ness. I know that's not a word. So the society currently has 310 members in 21 different countries. So I know we've been talking about like gender and race and LGBT, and those are all less visible, at least in terms of like names on a page. But we've always been, at least the Wallace community at large, has always been hugely international. Like you've got Grace sitting up there, who lives like in tomorrow. So she's traveled from the future to come back and hang out with us to talk about Wallace. So like we've always been this hugely international community of people who talk about Wallace, whether you're members of the society or not, just the people who talk about Wallace. Like there's the huge Italy contingent, there's Allard and the wherever you are from that I cannot remember now.
Where are you from?
Thank you. I knew it was one of those ones where I wouldn't like die of heat stroke. Sorry. And you've got the folks in Germany, and like we've always had that going for us. So now we get to look at the more intricate things, and I think that's what's kind of fun about like being us, so we can pat ourselves on the back for that. Like we're not a perfect group of scholars, and Wallace obviously wasn't a perfect writer, but I think that we as a group of Wallace people are pretty good at not like canonizing him. We don't say he's perfect, he's done everything perfectly, let's just leave it at that. Like we're not like the Hemingway Society who like refuses to talk about the man's faults.
Ooh, shade.
Yeah. Hemingway Society, you suck it.
Motherfuckers. All right, well, I appreciate it, y'all. I appreciate it. And Ryan, just send me an invite for the next panel. I appreciate it. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, guys.
All right, see y'all later.
All right. If you want, if you leave it on, you can talk to folks for just like one-on-one.
I mean, if anybody has questions, I'm here. I'm not an expert on anything, but
okay.
I'll hang out.
So what I'll do is I'm gonna turn off the big speakers, but if you like, please feel free to come up and talk with Andrea on the laptop.
Sorry, Allard.
It's okay. I should have said Amsterdam because who knows the Netherlands?